In story after story in the Bible, echoing the clash of battle across the books of Joshua, Judges, and Samuel, for more than 2 centuries, the Philistines are the embittered archenemy of the people of Israel. Though long gone, their warrior legacy still haunts the Holy Land. Israel's original name, Palestine, means land of the Philistines, a term first applied to the entire region by the Greek historian Herodotus when he visited here in the 5th century BCE. Living along the southern coastal plain, their civilization was anchored by 5 key cities: Ashkelon, Ekron, Gaza, Ashdod, and Gath. Having settled the area long before the exodus from Egypt, the Philistines may have blocked the way of the Jews to the Promised Land.
When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistines' country, though that was shorter. God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. Exodus 13:17.
The Bible tells us that rather than confront the Philistines, the Israelites undertake a lengthy detour through the wilderness, where they will wander for 4 decades. After the Israelites settle their new land, the Philistines begin to play an influential role in the fate of the region. God mysteriously uses them as instruments to punish the Israelites for repeated disobedience of his sacred covenant with them.
The Israelites continued doing what was evil in God's sight, and God subjected them to Philistine power. Judges 13:1.
Parts of biblical prophecy saw these enemies as tools of God, the rod of God with which God chastises the people for their sins. Now, this became a theme, and an important theme, in later prophecy.
The Philistines will be the bane of Israelite existence. They will go on to influence the lives of the Jews' first 2 great kings. But who were these seemingly aggressive foes? What kind of people would evolve into such a dreaded enemy? Until modern times, almost everything known about them came solely from the Bible, as recorded by the early Israelites. These are the ruins of Ekron, a principal Philistine city about 20 miles south of Jerusalem. Here, science and archaeology have changed our perception of this once feared people.
It's the only place till now where we have this overall picture of a city plan, of the fortification, of the industrial belt, well planned. And it seems that in antiquity, these people were very conscious of ecology, something that is so modern now. For us, it's very strange. We go back, and these people were definitely very aware not to have industry in the heart of the city. Then we find the belt where people lived. And then what we call the elite zone in the heart of the city, downtown Ekron, if you want to call it, we have the large buildings, the administrative buildings, the temples, the shrines. So the town planning is very important.
Today, the very word Philistine is a derogatory term describing someone lacking sensitivity and devoid of culture. In contrast, treasures found at Ekron and at other sites present contradictory new insight into these ancient foes.
The fact is that among the most beautiful things I have ever seen on display in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem are precisely Philistine objects. Pottery, sculpture, goddesses, gods, jewelry, craftwork, handiwork, which reached a level of aesthetic accomplishment which, in my judgment, is unequaled in the ancient land of Israel.
At about the same time the Philistines are developing their culture in Palestine, cave dwellers in Nevada first use primitive decoys for hunting ducks. Oracle bones in China are engraved with questions to aid the king in foretelling the future. And in Mexico, ceramic figurines are buried with the dead to indicate their social status. In other parts of the world, a new metal is first smelted and beaten into use. Its name, iron. Was this the key to the military power of the Philistines?
There was no blacksmith to be found in all the land of Israel, for the Philistines had said to themselves, the Hebrews might make swords or spears. 1 Samuel 13:19.
So the conventional wisdom is that the secret of Philistine technological superiority is that they were using iron while everybody else was using bronze, which is copper and tin. If that were true, it's completely obvious. An iron sword will cut a bronze shield. The only trouble is that the archaeology doesn't support it.
Iron does appear in small quantities in the 12th century. It appears first as jewelry. It was precious. Mainly in special objects, in objects like we have beautiful iron knife with an ivory handle.
Archaeologists continue to look for evidence that the Philistines might have had iron in sufficient quantity to equip an entire army. It is an unresolved question, but only one of a catalog of mysteries about these long-vanished people. Where did they come from? And why did they travel to the forbidding plains alongside the Mediterranean? Were they driven by some great calamity? A catastrophe linking them to one of history's most fabled civilizations? When we return, the Philistines at the mystical lost continent of Atlantis. In our pursuit of the mighty Philistines, we confront an undisputed fact. Whoever these mysterious people may have been, their culture was not native to the land that bears their name. In fact, they were foreigners, come from afar.
They weren't Semitic. Every time the Bible said Philistine, it said uncircumcised. Uncircumcised was a fact. It didn't mean they didn't like you. What it meant that the Philistines were not Semites. All Semite people were circumcised.
Where did the Philistines come from? While their great temples and palaces have disappeared, small fragments of pottery have survived. These are silent messages from the distant past, and they tell a revealing story.
When we first found this pottery, which is very delicate, very beautiful, decorated in a style that we know from Mycenae, we know from Crete, we know from Cyprus, when looking into it, we thought it was imported.
But tests showed that the shards had not come from foreign soil. The pottery had been locally made at Ekron itself. Ironically, it wasn't the pottery that was alien, but rather the people who made it. And they had brought their culture with them from the faraway Greek islands in the Aegean Sea. What made the Philistines leave their native land and set out on a perilous search for a new home?
Huge volcano, the one that blew up the island of Santorini, the one which may have given rise to the lost kingdom of Atlantis, since a whole civilization was blown apart by that volcano. That volcano was the beginning of disruption in the life of the islands. which was aggravated by invading forces coming into the mainland of Greece from the north, from what's now Bulgaria.
Displaced by natural disaster and by invasion, the Philistines fight their way south and east on a war-torn migration that lasted generations. Then, early in the 12th century BCE, they arrive at the shores of distant Egypt. This is the majestic temple of Medinet Habu in Thebes, capital of ancient Egypt. Its decorated walls bear witness to a local victory over invading foreign forces.
Those who entered the river mouths were like birds ensnared in the net. Those who came on land were overthrown and killed. Inscription at Thebes, Egypt.
The invasion that is stemmed comes from the Philistines, now thrown back by the Egyptians to what will become known as Palestine. But people known as Canaanites already live there. A dramatic discovery at Ekron provides telltale evidence of the brutal impact of the arriving Philistines.
When the Philistines arrived at this site, they found a small, perhaps 10 or 15 acre settlement which was localized in the northeast corner of the site in what we today are excavating as Field 1. Then it was tremendously destroyed around 1200 BCE by fire. We see the traces of that fire throughout Field 1. What makes us think that the settlement was destroyed by the Philistines is simply the fact of the great conflagration and then the Philistine settlement right on top of that conflagration. If the Philistines didn't do it, we don't know who did.
Archaeological evidence indicates that the Philistines arrived at Ekron in about 1200 BCE. But curiously, the Bible speaks of them long before then, at the time of Abraham, at least 500 years earlier.
To me, the greatest mystery about the Philistines is the insistence of the biblical narratives that there was an early group of people called Philistines in contact with the patriarchs, with the Hebrew patriarchs, Abraham and Isaac.
Some scholars believe these early references to the Philistines are fictional, created by later accounts. But many believe there really was a different group of people, also called Philistines. The question remains unresolved, as does another perplexing mystery, that of a missing city.
Identification of the 5 Philistine capital cities has been somewhat of a puzzle since the beginning of archaeology in this country over 100 years ago. But safely, I think, we can identify Ashkelon and Ekron and Gaza and Ashdod, cities which have more or less been excavated to a certain extent. However, the city of Gath remains somewhat of a mystery.
Gath was the home of Goliath, the famous Philistine giant warrior, but its ruins have never been found. One thing known with certainty about the Philistines is that they were a formidable enemy of Israel. But just what made them that way? When we come back, details of how an uneasy peace escalates into a vicious war that would dramatically change both nations forever. Sometime after the Israelites leave Egypt and settle in the Promised Land, they live as neighbors with the Philistines. But were they enemies then? Perhaps. A single story may contain a clue. It is the tale of the Israelite champion, Samson.
One day when Samson was in Timnah, he noticed a certain Philistine girl. And when he got home, he told his father and mother that he wanted to marry her. Judges 14:1.
The text in Judges does say that the Philistines were controlling the land and that they were dominant and that even they were oppressing the people. Nevertheless, the evidence is of trade, commerce, marriage, a cross-communication between the groups.
Samson marries an unnamed Philistine woman. At the wedding feast, he challenges his guests to a riddle. If they answer it, he will reward each of them with 2 robes. At first, the visitors are baffled, but soon they solve the puzzle. Samson is furious because his wife has secretly given them the answer. To find enough robes to pay his debt, he travels to a nearby city, kills 30 Philistines, and removes their garments. The incident sparks a fight that foreshadows greater conflicts to come between Philistine and Israelite. Nevertheless, Samson's unexplained fascination with Philistine women continues.
He seems to have almost an attraction, especially to the foreign woman, to Philistine women. Now, there's a sub-theme running in this story. The sub-theme is that Israelites were not intended to be intermarrying with non-Israelites. So one of the purposes of the story of Samson is to show that his weakness was brought about by his tendency to be attracted to a foreign woman, and particularly the woman of a foreign and enemy nation. Now, this theme of not intermarrying to preserving one's identity and integrity is a theme that runs through the entire scripture, not just in the early period, but continues on in the later period.
Later on, he fell in love with a woman in Sorek Valley. Her name was Delilah. Judges 16:4.
Once again, Samson is betrayed by a Philistine woman, this time fatally. Delilah persuades him to tell her the secret of his great physical strength. He is induced to reveal that if his hair is cut, his strength will disappear.
She snipped off the 7 braids of his head. The Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, and took him down to Gaza. But the hair of his head began to grow again. Judges 16:19.
Samson is cruelly brought out to amuse guests at a feast honoring a Philistine idol. In desperation, he prays fervently for one last burst of strength.
Samson reached around the 2 middle pillars on which the building was supported and leaned forward against them, one at his right hand and one at his left. Then said Samson, "Let me die with the Philistines," and pushed with all his might. The building collapsed upon the tyrants and all the people inside it. Judges 16:29.
A modern archaeological find at Tel Kasil, a site in the suburbs of present-day Tel Aviv, lends credibility to this extraordinary tale. It is an unusually well-preserved ruin of a Philistine temple, probably very similar to the one Samson destroyed. These are the bases of 2 major architectural support columns.
If you can visualize Samson standing between those 2 pillars and pushing against them, indeed, if you could cause those pillars to move and collapse, it would bring down the house upon the people within the structure.
When they are not directly encountering the Israelites, the Philistines are rarely mentioned in the Bible. That is why so little is known of them. But sometime around 1050 BCE, just after the Samson incident, the Philistines suddenly reappear in the biblical narrative.
In those days, the Philistines gathered to make war against Israel. They drew up their forces and the battle lines were deployed. 1 Samuel 4:1.
It is a mystery as to what triggers the major conflicts between the Philistines and the Israelites. Part of it, I think, is vying for occupation of the same territory. But I think part of it may well be the case that you have some of the larger world empires, the Egyptians particularly, who may be inciting some of these difficulties between various factions to their own advantage. They wanted to control this territory. And so their involvement in Philistine or Israelite policies would clearly be something that they would work to their own advantage.
The Philistines launch a brutal offensive strike deep into Israelite territory, triggering one of the major battles recorded in the Bible.
The Battle at Ebenezer is one of the extraordinary narrative moments in the early history of the Bible. The Philistines massed for attack. The Israelites came to head them off at the pass. The battle was going badly for the Israelites, and they said, we need some heavy artillery. And they called for the Ark of the Lord to come down from Shiloh.
The Ark of the Covenant holds the very tablets brought from Mount Sinai by Moses, the tablets on which are inscribed the 10 Commandments. It is the national treasure, the holiest single object of all Israel, believed to be imbued with enormous, almost magical powers. At first, the Philistines are intimidated by it, but they soon rally themselves against Israel.
And they did fight. And Israel was routed and fled, every man to his own tent. The slaughter was very great. There fell from Israel 30,000 of the infantry. Also, the Ark of God was captured. 1 Samuel 4:10.
The 30,000 men is a misfortune. The capture of the Ark is a catastrophe.
The catastrophe, however, is to be equally great for the conquering Philistines.
They couldn't deal with it. Its magic was too potent for them. They put it in their temple, and the next morning they found their god, the statue of their god, Dagon, fallen face forward and smashed on the ground. For the magic of the Ark of the Lord had overcome whatever magic their idol may have had.
Possession of the Ark brings panic and plague upon the Philistines, so they move it to another city in the hope of dispelling its mystical powers. Still, they suffer from its potency. Finally, they realize they can no longer harbor the sacred object.
When the Ark had been in Philistine territory for 7 months, the Philistines consulted their priests and diviners, asking, "What shall we do about the Ark of the Lord? Tell us how we may send it back to its place." 1 Samuel 6:1.
The Philistines place the Ark in a cart drawn by cattle which have never been in harness before. Set loose, the untrained animals mysteriously go as God directs them.
And the Bible account recalls how the cows, lowing as they went, going neither to the left nor to the right, went straight on the road back into the land of Judea.
The Ark returns here, once the site of the city of Beth Shemesh. Its ruins lie about 20 miles west of Jerusalem, still surrounded by fertile farmland, just as it was 3,000 years ago.
The people of Beth Shemesh were gathering the wheat harvest in the valley. When they looked up and saw the Ark, they ran rejoicing to meet it. 1 Samuel 6:13.
20 years pass before the Philistines launch an attack on Israel again. This time, the attempt comes at a place called Mizpah, where the Jews had gathered in prayer to reaffirm their faith. Now, God himself intervenes in the battle.
And the Lord thundered in a loud voice against the Philistines that day, and so confounded them that they were routed before the Israelites. 1 Samuel 7:10.
Victorious in battle, the Israelites now call for a profound change in leadership. Instead of being commanded by a prophet or a judge, they demand to be ruled by a king.
And one of the main reasons they call for a king, according to the chapter, is we want a king to fight for us so that we can be like the other nations. The implication being so that we can be like the Philistines.
So, ironically, the tribes of Israel unite into a kingdom, becoming more like the Philistines, the enemy they despise. When we return, Saul will be crowned Israel's first king. He will lead his people to heroic victories, to shattering defeats, and ultimately to a destiny that endures to this day.
Saul blew the horn throughout the land, and all Israel was told, Saul has slain the Philistine governor. Indeed, Israel has become obnoxious to the Philistines. 1 Samuel 13:3.
King Saul renews the war against the Philistines, attempting to drive them from Israelite territory. But he cannot achieve a significant victory. This may be due to the superior iron weapons used by the Philistines. But even so, their military strength may well have depended on other important factors.
The Philistines were the dominant military power in the region for about 2 centuries. Their skill as warriors is known somewhat from the archaeological record. They had the usual array of weapons that the other great powers had, but their true key to their success must have been in their tactics, in their military tactics and strategies that were used in battles, in actual combat.
The Bible tells us little about Philistine tactics, but in time they become boastful and complacent in their victories. Eventually they torment Israel with a new threat, a huge, towering warrior, the likes of whom have never been seen before.
And there marched forth from the ranks of the Philistines a certain infantryman from Gath, whose name was Goliath. 1 Samuel 17:4.
At first, no Israelite dares take up the challenge against the giant. But then, a young man appears, carrying nothing more than a slingshot. His name is David.
When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him because he was only a lad. "Am I a dog," he said, "that you come after me with a stick?" 1 Samuel 17:42.
David slays the powerful giant with a single stone aimed at the head. He is proclaimed a national hero, but the Philistine army remains intact. They are as much a threat as ever before. But a fateful turn of events will lead to their downfall. It begins with King Saul's sudden jealousy of David, now the new hero of the people.
Saul tried to strike David with the spear, but he broke away from Saul, who stuck the spear in the wall. Then David fled and escaped. 1 Samuel 19:10.
David and 600 of his loyal followers are now on the run, hiding out in the rugged wilderness of Judea. King Saul becomes obsessed with finding him and putting him to death. But the enterprising young Israelite hero finds refuge in an unlikely place, in the enemy camp of the Philistines.
David said to himself, "Any day now I might be taken by Saul. There is nothing better for me to do but to escape to the Philistines." 1 Samuel 27:1.
He actually found himself at a certain point in the camp, in the cities of the Philistines, whose king was delighted to have him, because when you have a great warrior, especially one of your enemy's famous people, then it's a great accomplishment on your behalf. But David managed to finesse it so that he never actually really did harm to the Israelites, which is what the king thought he was doing. But the way that he finessed it was to attack a local Philistine village instead, and to kill every man, woman, and child, so there'd be nobody left alive to say that David had attacked us, when the king thought he was attacking the Israelites. And that's pretty rough.
King Saul has maintained his relentless war against the Philistines, but is about to meet a grisly fate. The end will come here at Mount Gilboa.
The Philistines fought with Israel, and as the men of Israel fled before them, falling wounded on Mount Gilboa, the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons. 1 Samuel 31:1.
Rather than be taken alive, Saul commits suicide by falling upon his own sword. To celebrate their victory, the Philistines mutilate his corpse and place it on public display. By now, Saul's army has been decimated, the kingdom cut in two. With Saul's death, the Philistines have unknowingly set themselves on a path leading to their own ultimate defeat. But with Saul out of the way, it is now safe for the renegade David to return to his people. He has remained their hero and is crowned new king of Israel.
When the Philistines heard that David had become anointed king over Israel, they came up in search of him. 2 Samuel 5:17.
A fierce battle is fought on the plain of Rephaim, just outside Jerusalem. David repulses the first Philistine attack, but they regroup and strike again. The young king prays for divine advice, and God responds.
Don't make a frontal attack. Go behind them and come out by the trees. When you hear a sound like marching feet in the tops of the trees, attack. For it will signify that the Lord has prepared the way for you and will destroy them. So David did as the Lord had instructed him and destroyed the Philistines all the way from Gibeon to Gaza. 2 Samuel 5:23.
In this single military engagement, David shatters Philistine domination so thoroughly that they will never again be a threat to Israel. The victory is a momentous one, but even today it remains one of the most puzzling in biblical history.
We wish we knew how he did it, but we don't. The biblical accounts of the battle of David against the Philistines, what he did, how he did it, why he did it, these accounts are sorely lacking. We don't know exactly how David conquered the Philistine nation, but we know that he did. We know that after King David, the Philistines ceased to exist as a force threatening Israel.
The answer to the mystery may lie in David's sojourn with the Philistines while he was hiding from Saul.
It seems to me that in those years when he was in exile with the Philistines, he must have learned quite a bit about Philistine military tactics, techniques, armaments, and the use of logistics in support of an army. And all of this he put into good use when he later on, after some years, became the king of the Hebrews and had to face his former overlords as his enemies now. And he was able to put this knowledge into use and defeat them with their own games, at their own tactics, and at their own strategies.
It is likely that David's army may well have included mercenary Philistine soldiers, paid by him to fight against their own side.
There is room for speculation about many foreigners involved in David's rise to victory, and including Philistine involvement in David's rise to victory. David was not above the use of mercenary forces who were dedicated to David through the riches that resulted from his great victories, as well as through any moral dedication to David's God.
While King David's victory destroys Philistine military power, their civilization lingers for many centuries. Then, suddenly, it vanishes, so inexplicably that the mystery has never been solved. When we return, examining this curious enigma casts a surprising light on why the Jews have endured to the present day, while the Philistines disappeared for all time. Seeking clues to the capricious disappearance of the Philistines, archaeologists working here at Ekron and at other sites have uncovered layer by layer a dramatic sequence of events in Philistine life.
We are seeing here the lower city, the Philistine city that was built at the beginning of the 12th century. This is the elite zone where the palaces, the shrines of the Philistines were found. And it's, in a way, very exciting because we go through history. We start in the 12th century in these great buildings, and we end here in the 7th century, which is above me. So in a way, we walk through the beginning of the Philistines and the disappearance of the Philistines in this elite zone.
At the beginning of the 7th century BCE, 300 years after the Philistines were defeated by David, a new enemy appears. They are the Assyrians. Their conquest of the Holy Land affects the Philistines living at Ekron. The Philistines produce olive oil, a vital commodity in the ancient world. Rather than destroy them, the Assyrians incorporate the Philistines into a lucrative commercial enterprise.
Approximately at the beginning of the 7th century BC, this great imperial government decided that for its own reasons, they would concentrate the production of olive oil in one center. And they invested a huge amount of money, capital, equipment.
Ekron thrives under Assyrian rule, which lasts only a century. Then, around 600 BCE, the land is overwhelmed by yet another powerful invader, the Babylonians.
For Gaza will be abandoned, and Ashkelon left in ruins. Ashdod will be emptied, and Ekron uprooted. The land of the Philistines I will destroy. Zephaniah 2:4.
This is debris from the Babylonian onslaught. Surprisingly, no human bones have been found in the rubble. Scholars believe that rather than face the Babylonians, the Philistines uproot themselves and flee for their lives.
It was an extremely cruel destruction. There was really no reason to destroy a city that wasn't defending itself. And in doing so, the Babylonians lost a great commercial olive oil production center, a great basis for taxes. In other words, their imperial policy was more of a destructive nature, not a creative one.
The Babylonian invasion also destroys the neighboring cities of the Israelites. Yet the Jews have survived the ensuing centuries, while the Philistines disappeared. Many believe this may be due to the Jews' passion to preserve their cultural identity.
I think in the case of Israel and of the ancient Israelites and then subsequently Judaism, you have an example of a people who have maintained a very strong sense of their identity, of their faith, their culture, and their tradition. But part of that is because they always believed it to be important. Part of it was as an assignment, as it were, or even a gift from God, this identity and this culture.
Once driven by invasion from their cities, the Philistines may have been assimilated into surrounding tribes. Their traditions may simply have been absorbed into the cultural spectrum of societies around them. Paradoxically, another clue to their disappearance is suggested by the complete absence of evidence.
A civilization, by all accounts, technologically advanced, competent, and organized, yet they have never found Philistine writing. How can you make a civilization without writing? How can you function without writing? And yet, nobody has found, or certainly if they found anything, haven't deciphered, anything approaching Philistine writing.
Archaeologists have unearthed intriguing artifacts that allude to writing, but there is as yet little consensus as to whether the primitive marks on these pottery fragments represent writing or merely decoration.
Only one object was found, and that was in Ashdod. It's a cylinder seal on which we have signs, and very, very beautifully carved signs, which must be letters. Must be some signs of writing. But it's the only really seal that has been found, and when it was found, we went to the experts on the Greek writing, the early Greek writing. They said, well, go and find an archive. This is not enough for us.
If the Philistines were able to write, did they record their history, their way of life, or their religious beliefs? We may never know. Today, work continues unabated at Ekron in pursuit of the mysterious Philistines. In contrast to them, the Israelites chronicled their history. They recorded their struggles and conquests in a book called the Bible, so that future generations may study their heritage. The Philistines had no such book. Perhaps this is why the Jews have survived the centuries, while the Philistines, their ancient archenemy, merely receded into oblivion.